Good afternoon, and welcome to Grace and Gavel, where the truth meets compassion. My name is Buffy. I'm an almost 18-year criminal defense attorney, and today we're talking about why juries acquit people the public has already convicted. We've all seen it happen. A verdict is read, and the public is stunned. How many of you remember the O.J. Simpson trial, right? That was one that was definitely surprising. Social media erupts, headlines explode, and the question everyone asks is, how could the jury get it so wrong? Tonight, I want to talk about why that question is often backwards. Because jurors aren't deciding what the public thinks they're deciding. Let's set the frame here. This channel looks at true crime through the lens of law and psychology, not moral pylons or character judgments. So this isn't about defending anyone. It's about understanding how verdicts are actually reached and why they so often clash with public opinion. The illusion of certainty. By the time most of us encounter a case, we've already absorbed hours of commentary, clips, headlines, and speculation. Our brains don't experience that as information. They experience it as certainty. And certainty feels good. It feels safe and it feels like control. But certainty is not evidence. And furthermore, just because the news can give you snippets into someone's life, into their activities, into other things, not everything that the news presents would be admissible in court, because some of it could be potentially inflammatory. Some of it could be hearsay, and hearsay generally has special exceptions. And if those exceptions aren't within the realm of what's being offered, then the judge can sustain them or exclude them from evidence. So ultimately, as a viewer of the news, you probably see a lot more information than will come from the court and will go into the court case, just because a lot of it could prejudice the defendant. And ultimately, defendants have the right to a fair trial, not speculation. That's why things like character evidence is oftentimes inadmissible, because it acts as a bad man kind of defense. So you might have heard, for instance, I think a lot about the Scott Peterson case with Amber Fry. Remember, she was the one who was having the affair with him. And that tidbit could have potentially resulted in his guilty verdict, because people thought, oh, he's a bad man. If he cheated on his wife, then he had reason to murder her or harm her in some way. So you think about things like that, like even the smallest thing could tip a jury against a criminal defendant. And so you think about inside the jury room. The jurors are given all sorts of instructions before they go back for deliberations. They are able, depending on the jurisdiction, to do certain things such as take notes and all that. But jurors a lot of times are sequestered, which means they're, depending on the length of the trial, could be put up in a hotel for a period of time in which they're not able to access, like online. They're not able to access family members. They're not able to access news and things like that, because they don't want any outside information other than what is provided by the prosecution and the defense attorneys. So they don't get headlines. They're not getting podcasts. They don't get hindsight. They get evidence that meets strict legal rules. And generally for the jury instructions, both the prosecution and the defense counsel get to look at the jury instructions to make sure that they're suitable and agreeable to both sides. They can also do things such as stipulations. And stipulations are the agreements that the prosecution and the defense attorneys agree to. So for instance, let's say they want to say this case occurred in Orange County, California. They would stipulate to things like that. The defendant's name is Bob R. Jones. They would stipulate to that, right? Things like that. The victim's name is Sam Renee Johnson, right? Making up these names as I go, obviously. And they may also stipulate other things. So ultimately, the jury trial is very kind of constricted. And it's constricted to make sure that it doesn't violate the defendant's rights, ultimately. And so they also get testimony that can be challenged, right? Because obviously the prosecution and the defense are on separate angles. So the prosecution is going to look for things that show an indicia of guilt, mens rea, whatever they think is their theory of the case. Theory is oftentimes not, motive is not required, we should say that. But generally the prosecution has their theory of the case. You know, whether it was heat of passion, whether it was an intentional murder that showcased mens rea, which is guilty mind, things like that, that it wasn't clearly like self-defense, things like that. And instructions that limit what they're allowed to consider, because ultimately the judge is going to be the trier of fact. He's going to determine what is allowed, what is overruled, what is sustained, which sustained does not get in because it doesn't meet the rules. So the jurors are not allowed to decide who feels guilty, right? I mean, no gut feeling in the world is going to tell you that that person is guilty, right? Nor should you base your feelings on whether or not someone is guilty based on what they look like, their mannerisms. You know, I've done podcasts on the optics, right? We've talked a lot about optics here recently, how media kind of sensationalizes and kind of causes some sort of like perfectionism thing going on, and people are harshly judged. Ultimately, that should have no place in a criminal trial where someone is facing the loss of life or liberty, right? Absolutely not. Should that not have a place? Because no one is that sharp of a judge of character to be able to say, oh, that person's 100% guilty, like lock them up. They deserve to be locked up for life. Maybe they even deserve the death penalty. Like, no. Or who should have known better, right? Because ultimately they judge survivors or victims as well. They are asked one question only. Did the state prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt? Now, beyond a reasonable doubt, is a very, very high bar. Does it mean that he rolled his eyes when the prosecutor asked him a question? Oh, he must be guilty. Did he huff when the prosecutor asked him another question? Oh yeah, he must be guilty, right? No, like this is a very high, serious standard. And the idea that someone would take this lightly is extremely disturbing. So the public often believes that trials are about truth, but they are supposed to be about truth, yes. But criminal trials are about proof. So just because you have a sinking suspicion that this person committed this crime, that's really not proof. Proof is, were his fingerprints found? Was his DNA found? Did he confess? Was his confession consistent with what happened? Right? There's got to be more than just his confession. There has to be some sort of proof that puts him and connects him to that crime. There are a lot of cases where people make false confessions. Maybe they feel that there is pressure on them. Maybe they're thinking that if I confess to this, then I can go home tonight, right? Especially when you're dealing with juveniles, when you're dealing with people who have a lower IQ, who can be tricked and goaded into saying certain things. The other thing is a lot of people don't understand that law enforcement can sometimes mislead or say things that aren't true to try to figure out if that person actually did that. A lot of people have a problem with that. And proof is narrower than emotion, narrower than outrage, and narrower than discomfort. So when a jury acquits, it can feel like betrayal. Not because the jury failed, Because ultimately, if they deliberated within the rules and they did what they were supposed to do, meaning they were able to come to a meeting of the minds, they were able to reach a verdict that everyone agreed upon. Can you imagine? Like, for instance, especially if you're in a case where there's 12 jurors. I mean, getting 12 people to agree on anything is like a huge feat, right? So, I mean, clearly they were doing the work if they were able to do that. Not because the jury failed, but because our expectations were never aligned with the law in the first place. And the law can feel foreign. It can feel like it's a high bar. But ultimately, as they say, it's better that one guilty man go free than one innocent man be charged for something that he didn't do. So let's talk about optics versus evidence. This is where things can get uncomfortable. Public opinion is heavily influenced by personality. We've talked a lot about that, meaning whether someone's friendly, if they're friendly and they're smiley and they seem happy and with it, you might like them, right? Their appearance, are they attractive or are they not attractive, right? That can also play a part. How someone grieves. I know a lot of people had issues with Darlie because she did the silly string thing, and we talked about the optics there. But ultimately, people can be misconstrued. People grieve differently. Not everyone is going to be like incapacitated by grief. Not everyone is going to want to shed public tears for people, to perform for people, to show them how sad they actually are. How they speak. Maybe they don't speak properly. Maybe they speak roughly. Maybe they seem like, they're not as educated. And so some people feel uncomfortable by that. Or how closely they match our idea of normal. Because ultimately, every person that we see and every person that we view them through our own lens, through our own paradigm. Biases we have, stereotypes we may carry. That's what we do. We try to have our version of what we think people should look like or how people should act when things happen. Juries are instructed to ignore all of that. The public is not. The gap between optics and evidence is where most outrage lives. Because ultimately, if we were sitting in the defense chair, being the defendant, we would want all of these things to happen for us. And if they didn't, we would be outraged, as we should be, because everyone is supposed to be guaranteed a right to a fair trial. And here's the quiet truth. An acquittal doesn't mean nothing bad happened. It doesn't mean pain isn't real. And it doesn't mean the outcome feels fair. It means the legal standard was not met, that the jury did not feel like there was enough evidence to convict. And ultimately, oftentimes the jury is confronted in certain cases. So being a juror can be difficult sometimes as well. And that standard exists for a reason, because certainty without proof is dangerous. It's like a vigilante mob. Like, would you want someone coming after you like, I know you were guilty. I mean, you got acquitted, but I know you were guilty. No, you would not. So in closing, juries aren't there to validate how we feel. They're there to protect against punishment based on certainty alone, especially when most of the people who are watching the trials don't fully understand the legal rules, don't understand like why there are so many safeguards. There's safeguards so we're all protected. We are a civilized nation, right, guys? Come on. And when a verdict clashes with public opinion, the question isn't always what went wrong. Sometimes the real question is, what were we expecting the law to do that it was never designed to do? And that's where things get interesting. Thank you for tuning in to Grace and Gavel, where truth meets compassion. Again, my name is Buffy, and I appreciate each and every one of you tuning in, and I hope you got a little bit of insight, and hopefully you'll come back and check us out again soon. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.